You've seen the name 100 times without thinking about it. It's on a $30 plug-and-play console at Walmart, a joystick keychain, a mobile app full of ads, a t-shirt in the retro aisle at a mall you don't visit anymore. 4 letters, easy to say, older than almost anything else in a tech aisle, Atari. You probably assume that behind the name is a company. A real one, with an office, a product roadmap, a founder still cashing checks. It's a reasonable assumption. It's also wrong. The company that put that name on a screen for the first time went bankrupt, got sold for parts, merged into a hard drive manufacturer, changed hands 4 more times, and finally filed for bankruptcy again in 2000. Not to shut down, but to cut itself loose from a French parent company that was dragging it under. What's left today is a small public company on the Paris Stock Exchange, run by a man named Wade Rosen, mostly licensing the old catalog back to you in tidy little boxes. Rosen controls the company through a holding entity called Irata LLC, Atari spelled backward, which owns roughly a fifth of the shares. In the last few years, the company has walked away from side bets in crypto and online casino gaming to focus on exactly one thing: re-releasing 40-year-old catalog titles to people who remember playing them the first time. That's now. Here's then. In June 1972, two engineers named Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney put somewhere between $250 and $350 each into a company they almost called Syzygy, before settling on a word borrowed from the board game Go, a term for a stone in immediate danger of capture. Their office was a spare room in an industrial park in Santa Clara, California. Their first product wasn't even sold. It was placed. One machine, one bar, Andy Cap's Tavern, a converted black and white television bolted into a wooden cabinet with 2 knobs on the front. The next morning, it was broken. Not vandalized, jammed. So many quarters had gone into the coin slot overnight that the milk carton catching them inside the cabinet had filled up and stopped the machine dead. Here's the reframe, and it's the one thing to hold on to for the next 20 minutes. Atari was never really a video game company. It was a coin-vending business that happened to have a television screen bolted to the front of it. The games were the excuse. The quarters were the point. Everything that made this company work, and everything that eventually broke it, traces back to that distinction. You're going to watch it play out 3 times, once in a bar in 1972, once in a Sears catalog in 1977, and once in a landfill in New Mexico in 1983. Take the romantic version seriously for a second, because it's not a bad plan. 2 engineers, barely any capital, build something simple enough that a stranger understands it in 5 seconds, place it somewhere people already are, and let the money come to them a quarter at a time. That's the pitch. Now watch what it actually costs to run. Bushnell and Dabney didn't meet in a garage. They met at Ampex, a Bay Area company that built professional video recording equipment for broadcasters. Dabney had been there roughly a decade, an electronics design engineer working on real, expensive machines. Bushnell was there too, Junior, absorbing what it actually cost to build serious hardware at scale. Neither man arrived at video games as an outsider chasing a hobby. They arrived as engineers who already understood signal processing, coin mechanisms, and manufacturing costs before they'd built a single game. In spring 1921, while still employed at Ampex, they built a coin-operated version of a mainframe game called Space War, running on transistor logic instead of an actual computer. That distinction mattered more than almost anything else in this story. A mini-computer capable of running Space War properly cost around $20,1971. You cannot put a $20,000 machine in a bar and expect quarters to cover it. TTL chips, cheap, mass-producible transistor logic, could fake a stripped-down version of the same game for a fraction of that cost. That's the only reason any of this was financially possible at all. They licensed the design to an existing manufacturer, Nutting Associates, who built and sold it as Computer Space in 1971, generally credited as the first commercially sold arcade video game. It flopped. Not because the technology failed, but because a drunk stranger in a bar couldn't figure out the controls fast enough to enjoy it before the game ended. Complexity was the whole problem. Nutting Associates never made Bushnell and Dabney rich either. Licensing deals in the coin-op industry of that era typically paid the designer a modest royalty per unit, nothing close to the margin a manufacturer kept for itself. License it, and someone else keeps most of the money. Build it, and you keep it, if you can survive the building part. Bushnell had just watched that trade-off play out on Computer Space. He wasn't going to make the same choice twice. That May, Bushnell watched a demonstration of the Magnavox Odyssey, a home console that included a simple table tennis game. He didn't buy one. He remembered it. On June 27, 1972, Bushnell and Dabney incorporated on their own. They hired an engineer named Alan Alcorn and gave him what they framed as a training exercise. Build a basic table tennis game, nothing fancy, just to get him used to their hardware. 2 paddles, 1 ball, 1 number, counting up on each side. No manual required? No learning curve. That exercise became Pong. This is the pivot, and it's the one that actually funded everything that came after. Computer space was licensed out to someone else's factory, complicated, and a commercial failure. Pong was built in-house, stupidly simple, and it jammed a coin box in one night at one bar. The lesson Bushnell took from that wasn't about game design, it was about audience. He wasn't building for people who liked computers, i.e., he was building for people already standing in a bar with a pocket full of quarters looking for something to do between drinks. That's the market condition that made the whole company possible. An existing, mature, coin-operated amusement industry, pinball machines, jukeboxes, cigarette machines, already wired into thousands of bars with distributors, route operators, and coin collection habits already built. Atari didn't need to invent a business. It needed one product simple enough to slot into a business that already existed. Within a year, Atari was building Pong cabinets by the hundred, priced to operators at somewhere around $1,200 each. Here's the arithmetic that made an operator say yes to that price. $1,200 divided by 25 cents is 4,800 quarters. Split the take roughly 50-50 with the venue, the way coin-op revenue was typically divided, and an operator needed something like 9,600 total plays before that single cabinet had paid for itself. A cabinet in a busy bar could clear that in a matter of weeks, not months. That's the entire coin-op business model in one calculation. A 4-figure hardware cost recouped in a few thousand quarters, after which every additional coin is close to pure profit for whoever owns the machine. Atari wasn't the one collecting those quarters long-term, but it had already been paid in full before a single one dropped. After that first night at Andy Capp's tavern, Bushnell made a decision that should have ended the company before it properly started. Nutting Associates, the manufacturer who'd built computer space for him, was the safe, obvious move. License Pong out, take a royalty, let someone else's factory and someone else's balance sheet carry the risk. Instead, Bushnell decided Atari would manufacture and sell Pong itself. This was not a startup with money. It was 2 guys and a few $100s of starting capital, less than a year old, based in a rented industrial unit. Building your own factory floor, buying your own components, assembling your own cabinets, that's not a scrappy pivot. That's a company betting its own existence on a product it had field-tested exactly once. Here's why it should have failed at the financing stage alone. Coin-operated machines in 1972 carried a real stigma. Pinball had spent decades associated, fairly or not, with organized crime, and banks treated the whole coin-op category as close to an unlendable risk. Atari went looking for a line of credit to fund manufacturing. Most lenders wouldn't touch it. Wells Fargo eventually extended one, but reportedly for around $50,000, a fraction of what an actual production run required. Do the math on what that meant. A rented former roller skating rink, 25,000 square feet at 1600 Martin Avenue in Santa Clara, needed fitting out as an assembly line, built by a new hire named Bill White. Components, labor, cabinetry, and shipping for even a modest first run of a few hundred units would run into 6 figures. $50,000 doesn't cover that. It covers maybe the first third of it if you're careful. There was no plan B, no venture capital safety net. The institution barely existed for hardware startups in 1972 the way it does today. No parent company to absorb a bad quarter. No second product waiting in the wings if Pong flopped at scale the way computer space had. If the first few hundred units didn't sell fast enough to fund the next batch, Atari simply stopped, and everyone went and found a normal job. Atari had to build, sell, and collect on units fast enough that revenue from the earliest cabinets funded parts for the next batch. A manufacturing operation running on its own cash flow with almost no cushion underneath it. That's the bet. Not will people like Pong. They already knew people liked Pong. The jammed coin box at Andy Capp's told them that in one night. The bet was narrower and scarier. Can we build fast enough on borrowed money, a fifth the size we actually need, before we run out of cash waiting for quarters to come back in? It worked. Barely, and only because Pong's simplicity cut both ways. The same stripped-down design that made it playable to a stranger also made it cheap to manufacture. Few components, a repurposed black and white television as the display, minimal custom tooling. A more ambitious product would have needed capital Atari simply didn't have. By 1973, the company had moved twice, first into that fitted-out roller rink, then into a proper headquarters on Winchester Boulevard in Los Gatos. Headcount went from a handful of engineers to a production floor employing dozens, then hundreds within about a year. By the end of that year, the payroll had grown from 3 founders to well over 100 people, most of them running shifts on that assembly line to keep up with road operators who wanted cabinets faster than Atari could build them. None of that hiring happens if the Pong bet doesn't pay off fast, on thin financing, with no room for a slow start. This decision, build it yourself on borrowed money you don't really have enough of, betting on speed, is the moment Atari stopped being a design studio that licensed ideas to other people's factories and became a manufacturer. Every advantage the company had for the rest of the decade traces back to that choice. So does almost every problem it had after 1982, when manufacturing capacity built for a boom suddenly had nowhere to go in a bust. By 1976, Bushnell owned Atari outright, and he was staring down a decision that had nothing to do with games and everything to do with capital. The arcade business threw off real cash, but building a home console, something with a chip inside it that could play more than one game, needed money on a different scale than a business funded quarter by quarter out of bar cabinets. He had 2 paths. He could stay independent, keep full control, and fund console development slowly out of arcade profits. The same bootstrapped, cash flow constrained approach that had built the company from a $50,000 line of credit and a rented roller rink 4 years earlier. It had worked before. It would just take longer, and a slower company risked losing the console race to whoever moved first. Or he could sell. In 1976, Bushnell sold Atari to Warner Communications for a reported $28 million, and some sources put the figure as high as $32 million. That's real money for a company that had started on $250 to $350 each from 2 engineers in 1972. It bought Atari something arcade revenue alone couldn't: a media conglomerate's balance sheet behind a console that needed to be developed, tooled, and mass-manufactured before a single unit sold. Here's the case for staying independent. You keep every decision. You keep the upside if the console works, you don't answer to a parent company's quarterly targets, and you don't get overruled by executives who've never built a coin-op cabinet in their life. Bushnell built this company on instinct. The Pong bet was pure instinct, and instinct doesn't always survive a layer of corporate management. Here's the case for selling. Speed. A media company's capital gets you to market before a scrappier, slower competitor does, and in a category this new, being first onto a national retail shelf might matter more than owning 100% of a smaller pie. Warner's money is also patient in a way a $50,000 bank line never was. No scrambling to fund next month's parts order out of this month's quarters. Bushnell sold. Warner's capital did fund the VCS, and it did get Atari onto national shelves faster than an independent, arcade-funded Atari plausibly could have managed alone. But selling also meant Bushnell no longer controlled the company he'd built, and within a few years, he was pushed out of it entirely. Bushnell didn't disappear after that. He went on to found Chuck E. Cheese and a long string of other ventures, some more successful than others. Proof that the fork he faced in 1976 decided Atari's future, not necessarily his own. Neither answer here is wrong. Keep control and move slow, or move fast and answer to somebody else's board. Whichever you pick, you've just locked in who makes the next call when the money runs tight. And for Atari, within a decade, the money ran very tight indeed. Quick question before the mechanism. 2 customers, same era, a kid who saves up and buys an Atari console for their bedroom, and a bar owner who buys a Pong cabinet for the corner by the pool table. Which one is worth more to Atari? Most people say the kid. More consoles sold, bigger market, that's the real video game business. Read that again. Which of those 2 is actually worth more? Here's why it's the wrong instinct, or at least why it was wrong for most of the 1970s. The bar owner doesn't buy a console once and disappear. That cabinet earns money every single day it sits against the wall, in quarters, for as long as people keep dropping them in, and Atari had already taken its cut of the machine's price before a single coin went in. A home console once sold generates nothing further unless the company can sell that same customer another product. Coin-op gets paid twice, once for the box and then indirectly, through pricing, for every quarter that box collects for years afterward. That's the mechanism underneath the coin-op years. Recurring revenue from a fixed installed base, flowing to whoever owns the route, with hardware sold once at a healthy markup just to get into that revenue stream in the first place. The engine had a second gear, retail distribution. Atari already had a relationship with Sears from selling home Pong consoles under license, and when the more advanced console launched in 1977, that relationship carried over, sold through hundreds of Sears stores nationwide under a rebadged label. A two-person engineering shop couldn't have built a national retail footprint on its own in a few years. Piggybacking on a retailer that already had the shelf space, the foot traffic, and the checkout counters did in months what building an in-house sales force might have taken a decade to do. The home console changed the math but not the logic. Once a machine was in a bedroom, Atari made its real margin on cartridges, not the box. Manufacturing cost per cartridge ran somewhere between $4.50 and $6. Advertising added another one to $2. Wholesale price to retailers, $18.95. Do that arithmetic. Even at the high end, $6 manufacturing plus $2 advertising, $8 total, Atari was clearing more than $10 of margin on every single cartridge, on a piece of plastic that cost a few dollars to make. That's not a video game business. That's a razor and blades business, where the console is the razor sold near cost and the cartridge is the blade sold at a huge markup. Over and over, for as long as the console stays plugged in. This is where the thesis from 20 minutes ago earns its keep. Atari was never really a video game company. It was a coin vending business and then a cartridge vending business, and the game inside the box was never really the product. The product was the ongoing right to keep charging you, a quarter at a time or a cartridge at a time, for access to a machine you'd already paid to bring into your life. There's a second piece of this worth naming because it's the part that eventually turned the engine against the company that built it. The console shipped with no licensing scheme and no lockout chip, nothing stopping a third party from making and selling their own cartridges for Atari's hardware. That openness is exactly what let the margin math above work for anyone who wanted to try it, not just Atari. 4 programmers who'd left the company feeling underpaid and uncredited for cartridges that had made Atari millions did exactly that. They started a company called Activision in 1979. Atari sued them in 1980 for $20 million, alleging trade secret theft. The case settled in December 1981. Activision agreed to pay royalties, and in exchange, the industry got a template. Anyone could publish games for Atari's hardware so long as they paid for the privilege. That settlement is generally credited with inventing the third-party publishing model every console maker still uses today. It also meant Atari no longer had exclusive access to the blade market it had built. Within 2 years, dozens of publishers were making cartridges for the same installed base, chasing the same $18.95 shelf price, and the platform Atari had engineered a perfect margin around started collecting more games than any single machine could plausibly need. By 1982, the machine Atari had built to extract steady margin from cartridges was collapsing under its own logic. Third-party publishers, legitimized by the Activision settlement, kept flooding the console's library with titles. Many of them rushed and bad, chasing the same shelf price with none of Atari's original manufacturing scale or quality control. The clearest single symbol of the collapse is a game called E.T., the Extraterrestrial. Atari paid a licensing fee for the film tie-in. Reported figures for the exact amount vary widely and aren't reliably documented, so treat any specific number for it with the skepticism it deserves, and had the whole game designed and coded in roughly 5 weeks to hit Christmas 1982. It's still cited, decades later, as one of the worst commercially released video games ever made. It didn't sell. Warehouses filled with unsold copies, alongside unsold copies of dozens of other rushed titles from Atari and its imitators. In September 1983, Atari trucked a large quantity of unsold and returned inventory, cartridges and hardware reportedly numbering in the hundreds of thousands, from a warehouse in El Paso to a landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico, where it was buried and covered in concrete. Contemporary local reporting described 10 to 20 truckloads. For decades, this was treated as an exaggerated legend. On April 26, 2000, an excavation confirmed it. Diggers recovered just over 1,300 games at the site. physically proving a story that had sounded too on the nose to be literally true. The financial picture behind that landfill is worse than the anecdote suggests. Atari's operations reported a loss of roughly $536 million in 1983 against revenue of about $1.1 billion. Do that math for a second. $500 million lost against just over $1 billion in revenue? You're losing close to 50 cents on every dollar that came in the door for an entire year to pay. Parent company Warner Communications posted a single quarterly loss of roughly $425 million, driven almost entirely by Atari write-downs. Atari cut close to 3,000 of its 10,000 employees in 1983 alone, 30% of the company gone in 1 year. It's not really a story about bad taste in games, however much E.T. gets blamed for it. It's the coin-vending logic running in reverse. The entire model, sell hardware near cost, make the real money on a steady stream of small, repeated purchases, only works if the stream of purchases stays scarce enough to be valuable. Once dozens of publishers could mint their own cartridges, the blade that had been worth $10+ in margin per unit became a commodity, and commodities don't hold an $18.95 price for long. The install base didn't shrink, the exclusivity did. That's what actually broke. None of this happened quietly. Atari had been, at its peak, one of the fastest-growing companies in American corporate history, faster to $1 billion in annual sales than almost any company before it. Watching that same company shed 30% of its workforce in a single year, then bury unsold product in a New Mexico landfill a few months later, is what convinced an entire industry that video games might be a fad rather than a category. Toy retailers pulled back shelf space for every console maker, not just Atari, for years afterward. The whole industry paid for one company's math. Atari wasn't alone in this. Mattel's Intellivision division, its most direct console competitor, took a $394 million write-off and effectively shut down operations in early 1984 after the same glut hit its own third-party cartridge market. Coleco's ColecoVision, another entrant chasing the same shelf space, never recovered its footing afterward, and the company filed for bankruptcy by 1988. This wasn't one company's mistake. It was a structural feature of a market with no lock on its own supply, hitting every player who'd built a business on the same razor and blades logic Atari had pioneered. Warner finally cut the cord in July 1984, selling Atari's home console and computer division to Jack Tramiel, who'd just left Commodore for $240 million, paid in notes rather than cash. The arcade division split off separately into a joint venture majority owned by Namco, with Warner retaining a 40% stake. The company that had bet everything on a $50,000 line of credit in 1972 was, 12 years later, broken into pieces and sold off in a deal structured to recover some value rather than write off the rest. There are two ways to tell this story, and both of them are true. The popular version, two scrappy engineers build a bar novelty out of spare parts, accidentally invent an entire industry, live the Silicon Valley legend, famously informal jeans and t-shirt board meetings, and cash out for millions before anyone else even understands what they've built. It's a great story. Most of it happened. The version the numbers support is less romantic. Bushnell and Dabney weren't outsiders. They were trained engineers from Ampex who understood hardware costs before they understood games. Their first product was licensed through someone else's factory, the conventional move of the era, not a rebellion against it. The company that eventually became a household name started on a few $100s each, and a bank loan a fifth the size it actually needed. Its defining strength, cheap hardware, expensive recurring purchases, was also the exact mechanism that let competitors and ex-employees copy the model and collapse the margin that made it work in the first place. And the sale that's remembered as a triumphant cash-out reads, in the numbers, more like a company that couldn't fund its own next product without help. Then there's what happened to the name itself, which nobody puts on a t-shirt. The Atari that made Pong doesn't exist anymore. Not legally, not operationally. It became Atari Corporation in 1984, merged into a hard drive company called JTS in 1996, had its trademark bought by Hasbro in 1998, got acquired by a French company that renamed itself Atari SA in 2009, and filed for bankruptcy again in 2000 just to separate its American operations from that same French parent. What you see on a console box today isn't a company with a 50-year memory. It's a trademark that survived 5 owners, licensed back to you by whoever currently holds the paperwork. There's a cost to that kind of survival, too. Every ownership change came with lawsuits, trademark disputes, and stretches of years where nobody was entirely sure who held the legal right to put the Atari name on a new product. A brand that outlives its company doesn't inherit a strategy. It inherits a filing cabinet of licensing agreements and whoever's willing to fight hardest to control them. That's the part worth sitting with. The games didn't make Atari valuable in the end. The name did. Durable, recognizable. Worth licensing long after every person who built the original product had left, retired, or been pushed out. Coin vending business, then cartridge vending business, and now, 40 years later, nostalgia vending business. Same company in spirit, if not in law. Same mechanism the whole way down. Build something cheap enough to get in the door and make the real money on what people keep paying for afterward. The screen was always just the excuse.